I'm not a survivor. I'm old enough to be. If I had been born in Europe, I might have been one of the children that got thrown away. I was born in 1943. Anyway, I'm here to facilitate and keep everything going. I'm delighted and want to thank you and your parents for agreeing to come to be part of this marvelous program. You're like eyewitnesses to history that a lot of people won't get a chance to see or hear. But it's not a pleasant thing, but it's so important. And for 35 years, students from Pennsylvania have been coming to this symposium. So you're part of a very important link to the past. I hope you'll take advantage of it. Today, I'm honored to introduce you not to a survivor, but to someone 27 years old, Mr. Aaron Jins. He's a drummer, a musician by trade. He was very fortunate to have his grandfather, who was a survivor, be in a very close relationship with him for many years. He only lost him a few years ago. So he's got a lot to tell us from having heard from his grandfather. And I want you to think about what you hear. Feel free at the end to ask questions. You probably have lots, but be part of this and get engaged. Aaron?
Thanks so much, Gail. Good morning, everybody. How are y'all doing? Doing all right? Day's been going well so far? Yeah, learning a lot? Amazing. So as Gail mentioned, I'm not a professional Holocaust educator. I'm a musician. I live in Brooklyn, New York. But I volunteer for an organization called 3GNY, and it's a group of what we call 3Gs, third generation survivors of the Holocaust. So all of our grandparents were survivors. And, just as time goes on, we're losing more and more survivors every year. And, it's important to us to keep these stories real and keep these stories personable. And I think, right, you can read about history in a textbook and not to knock textbooks, but, I think it is extra helpful when you're able to make a human connection. So I'm just so honored to be able to speak with y'all this morning about somebody who was very near and dear to me, my grandfather. I was lucky enough to get to know him really well. I went to college right near where he lived, and so he was every Sunday we'd go have lunch together. He was a big fan of the McChicken, even though I always wanted to go to maybe slightly more interesting restaurants. Every Sunday, McDonald's was his pick, so we had to go there. But anyways, growing up, there was never a time where I didn't really know about the Holocaust. People always ask me, what was it like learning about it for the first time when you were sat down? I said, well, I was never sat down and told the story of the Holocaust. It was just always something, from a very young age, I grew up just knowing that, to various degrees, my grandfather, when he was young, was a prisoner. I knew it was from Europe. He had a thick Polish accent always. But, it was very interesting and difficult for me as a kid to sort of understand that my grandfather was, as a kid, he was a prisoner, and he went through just some terrible years. But his crime was just being Jewish. That was it. And just as a kid, it was always something that struck me that was just very difficult to wrap my head around. But I think it's important to hear this story and I'm just so honored to share it with you today. So, my grandfather, who is the kid all the way on the left, and that's his mother to the right of him, he was born in 1927 in a small town of Borislav, Poland, right outside of a bigger city of Lvov, Poland. I'm not sure if you guys have been watching the news with Ukraine recently, but it's in what would be modern day Ukraine. Lviv, Ukraine is the big city. So he lived a fairly normal life as a kid. He went to school with Jews and non-Jews alike. He attended birthday parties. He even went skiing one winter. They lived in kind of a mountainous area, and his cousins belonged to like a little pool club, and so they had a fairly normal life as far as he could tell. But what I think he didn't understand, he was young at the time, was that sort of around him was a culture and growing anti-Semitism all around him. Every once in a while he'd be walking on the street, somebody would call him a name, and every once in a while there would be violence towards Jews in his town. But nothing that was so out of the ordinary. That was kind of life in Poland at the time. But when Hitler came to power in Germany, that was sort of a turning point for the Jews in Poland, because in his town that was sort of taken as a permission structure to start acting out on some of the anti-Semitism that the people had already held. It wasn't necessarily a new idea that when Hitler rolled into Poland that all of a sudden everybody became really anti-Semitic. This was always something that was present. This was something that for hundreds of years was sort of building and building and building. And when the Nazis finally invaded with their ideology, that was sort of the permission structure to begin to really act out on it. And it was at that time that things began to become different for my grandfather. He at the time of Poland, Stalin in the Soviet Union was also sort of fighting for power, and so Hitler and Stalin actually struck a deal to split Poland for a certain amount of time. And so after the German invasion, the Russians then actually were controlling my grandfather's town. And so he described it as life being better as compared to the alternative. But one of the shocking things was he walked into school on a Monday and school's in Russian. He didn't speak any Russian. And so that life was just clearly different. But after a while, Hitler went back on his agreement, and the Germans were once again in charge of his town, and that's when things really sort of took a pretty severe turn for the worse. My grandfather no longer was able to go to his school. Most of the Jews in the town lost their jobs, and all of the Jews in the town were forced out of their homes. So my grandfather and his parents were moved out of their home. Another Polish family moved in shortly afterwards. And all the Jews of this town were taken to what was called a ghetto. Are we familiar with that term? So they were moved to a small part of the town that the Germans had set up for the Jews to live for some time. And in some bigger cities, it was a neighborhood. It was a portion of town. In his town of Borislav, they took an old shoe factory and they sort of cleared it out, and the Jewish population was forced to live there. Now, my grandfather's dad was an engineer at the time, and he was working for the local oil company in the town. And so he was lucky enough that his job was essential enough to the German war effort that he was able to keep his job for some time. And over and over again, my grandfather credited some of his luck in surviving to the fact that his dad happened to have this job that was considered essential. So they were able to stay in the ghetto for longer than some of their neighbors. And my grandfather's dad was able to continue working. By sundown, they all had to be back in the ghetto. My grandfather was just about 12 at the time, and because he was no longer going to school, the Germans decided he was going to work in the local police station. And so he would leave the ghetto every day and would go work in this police station where, eventually he would see his friends and relatives and other Jews that he knew in this town come in and be processed and booked, and some of them were killed, just outside of the police station, and many others were deported to where he wasn't exactly sure. But he was able to see over and over again the same people from his childhood come through to this police station and be sent off. But he was lucky, and for a while, him and his family were spared until eventually the Germans decided to liquidate the entire ghetto, and him and his parents met the same fate. And so they were sent off. Maybe not. They were sent off to a concentration camp. There it is. So this is documentation, maybe, describing their deportation. And so they were sent off to a camp called Plaszow, which was a transport camp. There we go. So I'll show you here. This is my grandfather, Ludwig Hiss, and his father, Joseph Hiss, and these are the numbers that they were assigned. And this is a list of all of the Jewish men from this town. The women were on a separate list, but the Nazis kept very specific documentation on who they were sending where, and they wanted to have this very organized to make sure that they really could liquidate their country of Jews. And so in 1944, they were sent to this transit camp called Plaszow. And my grandfather described it as being extremely boring. This was a camp that had not yet been fully built, and it eventually became a work camp. But at the time, they were just sitting out in a field, just waiting to figure out where they were going to be eventually transferred to. And so for months, my grandfather described just sitting out in this field, just being hungry, and just not knowing whether it was today or tomorrow or another day that they were going to be sent somewhere across Europe. Eventually, the time came for my grandfather and his dad and his mom to be sent off, but the Nazis very often would separate men from women. They weren't very interested in keeping families together, and so while my grandfather and his dad were put on one transport, on one train, my grandfather's mom was put on another one, and at that point, that was the last time that he saw her. My grandfather and his father were sent to a camp called Mauthausen. This is in Western Austria, and unlike, I'm not sure what concentration camps you guys have studied in school thus far, but some were work camps where they were sort of working for the German war effort. Some were really specifically death camps where they were trying to kill people just as quickly and efficiently as possible. But Mauthausen was a little bit different. While there were gas chambers and there was mass killing, the most common method at Mauthausen was just to work people to absolute, to work people to death and just to denigrate and torture them just down to as little as possible as they could make these people feel. And so, as you can see on the right, this was what my grandfather and his dad had to do every day they were at Mauthausen. As you can see, they're at a rock quarry right outside of the camp. And there's 126 steps on this staircase, and what the prisoners had to do there every day was they had to grab a boulder and they had to carry it on top of their head, shoulder to shoulder with the other prisoners there, up the 126 stairs. And when they would get to the top, they'd put the rock down in front of the Nazi officer. He'd look at the rock, and he'd kick the rock down the hill. And they'd have to walk back down, grab the same boulder, carry it on top of their head, walk back up the stairs, put it down. Nazi officer would kick it down to the bottom of the hill, and again and again and again, all day. And as you guys have probably figured out, this work was not for any purpose. This was not to do anything other than to just humiliate these people. It was just to denigrate them and just take them down to the lowest possible. On the left is another common occurrence at Mauthausen. They would have to be forced to stand in these lines every morning, and this could be in the peak of the summer when it was really hot, to in the snow in the winter, and they'd have to stand in these lines. And this was for the morning count. And often the Nazi guards there would say, you know what, keep standing there. And sometimes that could go on for hours, sometimes days. And if you dropped, if you weren't able to keep your hands up, if you weren't able to do anything they said, you were killed. And so this was what my grandfather and his dad had to do for many, many years. Eventually, my grandfather and his dad were transferred to a sub-camp of Mauthausen, where they were forced to work in a German ammunitions factory, working on weapons for the war effort. And they were working with some pretty hazardous material, and were even sort of intermixed with workers from the town of Linz that the camp was in. But obviously they weren't given any of the protective equipment that the Austrians were given when they were working in this factory, and so it was a pretty hazardous place to be working. My grandfather's dad had always had sort of back problems growing up, and after many, many, many years of really grueling labor, his back just gave out on him, and he was sent to an infirmary. But unlike any sort of hospital that we're familiar with, if you were Jewish, they weren't interested in treating you. And so my grandfather knew that when his dad was sent to this infirmary, that was just about a death sentence. And he assumed that when his father went there, that was it. And it was confirmed to him when he did in fact see his body in one of these sort of infamous piles weeks later. But shortly after my grandfather's dad's death, the American army started getting very, very, very close to Mauthausen. And they could hear every night bombings and bombings and bombings and getting closer, and they could really start to tell that the Germans were losing this war when some of their guards would keep getting replaced, and the younger ones would have to start going to the front lines, and they were kind of replaced with sort of older and less idealistic guards who would tell them a little bit more about what was going on, and it became clear to them that the American army was getting closer and closer. One afternoon, the American army was getting so close that the Jews in this labor camp were marched out of the camp by their officers, and they just walked as far as they could during the day. At night, they were placed in this cave that they were told that they were going to be able to rest for the evening. And when they woke up in the morning on May 5th, 1945, they had been liberated. The American army had showed up, and the German officers had fled. And so that was the first time in many years that my grandfather was free. But he had lost his father. He had assumed that his mother was dead as well, and he was right. And he described the scene after liberation as just utter chaos. They just didn't know what to do. Obviously, there's still a war going on, and so my grandfather and some people that he had met in this camp just walked into town, and they found a house that was abandoned. What they assumed were Nazi sympathizers who had fled, and they spent some time in this house, and they ate their food and they wore their clothes, and slept in their beds, and just waited to see sort of what the rest of their lives were going to be like. Eventually, my grandfather was taken in by the U.S. Army and was sent to a displaced persons camp for refugees from the Holocaust. And there he worked for about a year for the U.S. Army, and he got to drive an American Jeep around Europe, transferring different supplies to the different military outposts. Something that he remembered fondly. And eventually he decided that he wanted to move somewhere. There were options for him to go back home to his hometown of Borislav, but, he knew his parents were dead and just he didn't feel like going back to a place that obviously had not treated him very nicely. And so, we had a couple options. There were organizations that were helping orphans move to South Africa or Israel or Australia. But, somebody had told him that you should really go try to get on the list to go to America. And he'd sort of heard about America growing up. And so he decided that's where he wanted to go. So he immigrated and was placed in an orphanage in Cleveland, Ohio. And he got to go to 1 year of high school. He was 17 at the time, so he got 1 year of high school in, and then began working odd jobs all over Cleveland, Ohio. Everything from selling clothes at a department store to even he was a hot dog salesman at the Cleveland baseball games, and he very proudly would always say that he was the #1 hot dog salesman at the baseball games because. While everybody else was selling hot dogs, was very focused on watching the game. He was from Poland. He didn't know what baseball was and couldn't be bothered to watch the game. Eventually, he worked for a home building company and was very successful in that. And eventually went on to start his own company in Ann Arbor, Michigan, building houses for people. He had 2 kids. And 3 grandchildren, including myself. And he went on to live a very nice second chapter of his life. But, when he was alive, he was always very passionate about sharing his story. And it's something that I'm really privileged to share to share it myself. As I mentioned, he did go to 1 year of high school, and when his English got good enough, he was asked to write an essay for the high school paper. And if it's all right with you guys, I'd love to read it for you. So he wrote, "There are many things that have happened to me and the thousands of other boys that to relate to all, or even a few of them, would be a job of tremendous proportion. Therefore, I would like to generally tell of the conditions under which I lived, which are representative of all our experiences. I believe I am repeating the essence of the stories that many boys now living in America, many boys still now in prison camps, and many boys that are now dead. It is a testimonial to the greatness of this country and to the belief that I have that the atrocities which led to the last war could never happen in the United States. I believe that what happened to me was of minor importance compared to what happened to many others. Let me first describe the general conditions under which we lived. We, 10 to 12,000 men and boys in a prison camp. We were Jews, Poles, Russians, and any people the Nazis didn't want alive. We were under the leadership of German guards and also of German convicts. Our food consisted of 2 plates of soup and 1/6 of a loaf of bread every day. The soup was like water, except that water would have been cleaner. We had 1 washroom for 2,000 to 4,000 men. The water only came up in the morning and was always cold. We had only 1 suit of clothes. I wore my suit for 2.5 years. We had wooden shoes and no socks. We were furnished with 1 bunk for 2 to 7 men, complete with 1 blanket to sleep on and 1 blanket to cover us with. There was no heat at all. The Nazis were seeing that we did not lead to a sheltered life. Fire was commonplace. We were enclosed by a wire fence, which was charged with electricity, so that if one touched it, the wire, he slowly burned to death. We worked from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. with a half an hour lunch period. We worked like dogs and were incessantly beaten. I had my face smashed with a rifle butt, losing 4 teeth just because a Nazi guard felt mean that day. I saw many people die from beatings. I saw people go to the hospital and never come back. I saw lice drink the last ounce of a dying man's blood. I saw inhumanity after inhumanity, death, disease, cruelty, and suffering without end. How is it possible to tell anyone what I saw when I've spent the last few months trying to erase the horror from my mind? I am lucky. I'm alive and I have my arms and legs. But hundreds of thousands of us died of violence and rotting diseases. It all adds up to one basic philosophy, the Nazi philosophy, that minorities are less than animals and that the aim of life is to hurt and kill others. This philosophy is one I hope could never take hold in the United States. This article is really a plea to the boys and girls of the school to remember the war and why it was fought, to remember that the principles of this country are opposed to such base practices as we had to endure in Europe. So that's what he wrote to his students. And I'm just very happy to be able to share the story with you guys. And I know it's a lot of information, but if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer anything you guys may have. And you can really ask anything. You're not going to offend me, I really promise. I'm happy to answer anything you guys want to talk about. So thank you. All right, who's going to be brave and ask the first question?
Nobody has questions.
Yes?
Cameraman. You have an attachment to music as a drummer. Did your grandfather ever talk about music or something that maybe helped him get by during that time? Or
You know, he wasn't much of a musician. He did love music when he came to the U.S. and really liked to go out and go to parties and have a good time. So I don't know where the music connection came from, but yeah, he when he came to the U.S. really thoroughly, he decided he was going to go out and enjoy himself and really did feel like he had a sort of second lease on life and yeah, really sort of took that opportunity to really go enjoy himself. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to ask you a question then. So, given the fact that there's just the survivor population is dying out, I find it to be a big responsibility to tell this story, and I think that anybody who hears these testimonies is now owns it, and so what we often like to ask our students is sort of what you guys think is something that you can do from hearing these testimonies, out in your own lives. Anybody have anything to share? Yes?
Carry out the story of what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you guys are going to, after high school, go on to do other things, go to college, go, all over the country. And you guys are going to meet people who don't necessarily know about this so much. And so it's, it's a big responsibility to be the people who, now that you have a pretty great understanding of what happened and what the facts are, that you guys are now sort of your own kind of custodians of these stories. Any other questions, guys? We got time. I can talk about my grandfather for a long time, but I'm always interested to what you guys think. Yes?
Did he ever say what kept him and his father going day to day? How did they manage to?
Yeah, I mean, it was, he always described it as he just got lucky. I mean, the odds were you didn't survive the Holocaust, right? I mean, it was very few people actually got out of there. And he just on many occasions happened to be in the right place at the right time, and happened to be, in the line that lived and not the line that died, and happened to be, moved to a different job at the right time, and just, I think he just found himself to just, kind of survive out of dumb luck. I mean, I think there was,
Did he ever go back to Europe?
So,
Did you?
so I did. So he went later in life. He'd always said that never wanted to go back. And was pretty adamant about that. But later in his life, decided when I was pretty young, decided that as he was older, he was going to go back and see his hometown one more time, and went and toured around, and decided he didn't really want to go back to the concentration camp. He'd seen it long enough, but he did go back, and I was lucky enough to go just about 5 years ago and see Mauthausen for myself, and it just is pretty harrowing to see. And something I saw there that he was always really struck with is, we always think of these concentration camps, sort of out in the woods, hidden, or some in some outskirts, and sort of the secret operation. This camp of Mauthausen was in a neighborhood. It was right smack in the middle of things, and when I went to visit, and you could stand where the camp was, the walls are still up, and some of the barracks are still there. You're standing in the middle of this camp, inside the walls, and you can see people's backyards. You can see people's houses, and so, it's really interesting to just, it's pretty harrowing to think that, people did know what was going on. And, the train station that they brought the Jews in on to go to Mauthausen, unlike Auschwitz, where like the tracks came into the camp, they just used the local train station that was down the street from the camp. So the Jews were marched from the train station in this town through the neighborhood up to the concentration camp. So, we gotta understand that this was it wasn't a secret. People knew this was going on. And so, that was always something that really struck him, that, he was almost more, he almost had more animosity towards just the people living in these towns rather than the Nazis themselves, right? I mean, obviously the Nazis themselves were terrible, but I think it hurt him more the bystanders who just sort of let it happen and turned a blind eye and pretended that they didn't know what was going on. I mean, I think sort of after the war, you sort of heard these stories that, I just had no idea this was going on, and it's hard to understand that to be true if there's a concentration camp literally, up the street from you, and obviously know what's going on. So, any other questions? Yes?
Did your grandfather ever talk about what it was like after his dad died?
He didn't speak to that exactly. I mean, amazingly, his dad died like days before liberation. So he was only in the camp, just a couple days without him, and then he was liberated, and then it was just utter chaos. But he was an orphan at that time, and I think compared to some of the other, some people survived along with their parents, and that obviously, right, he and that would obviously be more helpful, right? He was 17 at the time when he was liberated. I don't know, how old are you guys? 16? So just about your age, dropped off in a country that he had never been to, with nothing, no parents, no family. And so, I think that was something that was obviously very difficult for him. he was lucky enough to be able to be taken in this orphanage, and just really was able to work really hard and sort of make a life for himself afterwards. But yeah, I mean, I think I think it was something that really stuck to him, that his own parents were killed, and that his dad just missed liberation by a couple days. I think was something that was always hard for him to think about.
Did he say anything about the Americans that liberated them? Because Alan Muskin that we just heard, that was the camp that
Right.
he liberated.
Right. I never heard too many stories from my grandfather about the specific liberation. He just always would describe it as just absolute chaos. I mean, I think, yeah, I think we always kind of think about sort of liberation from these camps as sort of this like magical, like, oh, everything's done, back to normal, no problems. But, I think what's always really interesting to remember is that, they were these displaced persons camps, right? These sort of refugee camps for Holocaust survivors. They didn't exactly have their freedom there either, right? They were sort of these stateless people, right? Their citizenship was stripped from their home country, and they didn't really have a country of theirs. They didn't have any documentation. They didn't have any ID. They didn't have any possessions. And so they were kind of these, right? They were these people who were completely without a state, and were in pretty rough condition after years of being starved. So, my grandfather would always describe being in these DP camps as, as sometimes, he saw some things that were sometimes even worse than being in the concentration camp himself. People were unfortunately dying of overeating all the time. If you can imagine just after being starved for years, these people were my grandfather and the people who were in the camp with him were, just skin and bones, were just really, really, really underweight. And, if you ate too much, your body can't take that, and it's deadly. But something I always remember growing up is that my grandfather liked his food, but he would never eat peanut butter. He hated it. And the reason was when he was in these displaced persons camps, that's what the American Army was told to give them, because they weren't, the soldiers wanted to give out food, but it was too much for these survivors to handle. So they were given peanut butter every day for a while to sort of get them back to health. And he ate so much peanut butter in this displaced persons camp that he was done, and it was the last time he would eat that. And so, there was just, there's things growing up and knowing my grandfather that just, there were just these little pieces here and there that were carried on from his time in the Holocaust. And so, there was always a little lesson here and there of sort of learning more about what happened. Any other questions? Yes?
Did you ever keep in contact with anybody from the camps?
Great question. So I don't think he ever kept in contact with the people from his specific camps. I think there wasn't as much of a camaraderie as we may imagine. There was just, it was people were just keeping their heads down. People were just working, and people were dying all around. Like there wasn't a ton of time for getting to know people. But he did have a group that he kept in contact with of survivors from the orphanage that he went to. There was a whole group of survivors that were living with him there, and so that was a group that he kept in contact with throughout his life. So yeah. Other questions?
How did he meet your grandmother?
Great question. He when he was in Cleveland, Ohio, he one of the one of the things he did was he would go like sneak into parties all the time. That was him and his friends, like fun experience. And he went to a party one night, and my grandmother was working behind the bar, serving drinks. She had like subbed in for somebody who had gotten sick and was just working a little temporary job, and they met there, and that was it. So she grew up in Ohio. She grew up in a small town outside of Cleveland, and yeah, so. And they were happily married for, I don't know, almost 50 years. Any other questions? You can ask me anything. Maybe about the Holocaust and that, but.
Wait, if they had no possessions, how did they get those pictures?
Great question. See? Great question.
Maybe you should repeat the question so.
No problem. Okay. If my grandfather was stripped of all his possessions, how does he have any pictures? Great question. Okay, so let's see if he's in here. So his childhood best friend, his name was Yurik. He actually just passed maybe a year or two ago. I was lucky enough to know him. Was his neighbor and lived nearby. I'm trying to see if. So Yurik is, let's see. This is my grandfather, and Yurik is this guy. And so his story is a little bit different. His mother was a piano teacher in the town, and when the Germans invaded, one of her students, their families agreed to hide them in their attic, and Yurik stayed hidden throughout the entire war, and survived that way. And that's how. And when he eventually, years later, they were able to reconnect. Yurik lived in Israel, but they would go back and forth and see each other quite often. Yeah, he's the one down here holding the flowers as well. It's my grandfather on the right. And so yeah, they were able to find each other, and that's how he had photos of his childhood. So great question. What else, guys?
What did he tell you about that 1 year of high school? I mean, going from the age of 13 to 17 without having been in school, did he miss school, and was he glad to be in school?
Yeah, I think he was very fortunate to go to school. He seemed to like his fellow students. I think he got along with them well. I mean, it's really sort of humbling to think about it, but you know, he came to Cleveland, Ohio, not knowing a word of English. You know, and was definitely probably a unique member of this school, right? I mean, if you can think about just, you know, nowadays a kid coming from, you know, a war-torn country to your school, it's a big transition. It's got to be sort of a big shock. But yeah, he really enjoyed his time in Cleveland. The kids he was in the orphanage with became lifelong friends. Sort of the people who ran the orphanage, the family, the Apples was their family name. They kind of became a sort of a parental figure to him, and my parents remember quite often every family vacation would start with a road trip down to Cleveland to go see the Mr. and Mrs. Apple, and yeah, so I think he looked upon that experience pretty positively. Yes?
How hard was it to get a job after?
What was the question?
So the question was how hard was it to get a job? So he was lucky that there were businesses in Cleveland that were sort of interested in helping Holocaust survivors and were, generous in sort of allowing him to have a job in certain places. That's how he got involved eventually in this home building company. There was a Jewish guy who had owned the company and was just one of his sort of out of generosity wanted to hire a lot of Holocaust survivors who otherwise probably would have had a hard time finding jobs to do that. Obviously my grandfather didn't have much school, didn't go to college, had about a year of high school, and so I think if it wasn't for that, he would have had a pretty tough time finding a job. Yes.
Did you ever discover what happened to other family members?
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, right, as we saw, the Nazis took like very, very specific documentation on what happened. So, after the war, there were different organizations, including the Red Cross, that were helping people, find lost relatives. And so he eventually was able to through these different organizations figure out what happened to his mother. First off, she was sent to Auschwitz and died there, and he found out sort of the fate of other cousins and other family members who were also killed. But he did find one cousin of his who did survive. She's actually still alive now and lives in New Jersey. She survived Auschwitz, and so she was the only other family member that he knew that was still alive. So very good question.